The knock came at midnight, and it wasn't gentle, it was violent and urgent, the kind that makes your heart stop before your mind can catch up. I was sitting with my son in our living room. We'd been talking about his latest business deal, laughing about something small, and then that sound shattered everything. He froze mid-sentence, and I saw fear flash across his face, the same fear I'd spent years trying to protect him from. "Stay here," I whispered, but my voice was shaking. I walked to the door slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last, and when I looked through the peephole, I saw a shadow, a shape I recognized even though 17 years had passed, even though I'd convinced myself I'd never see it again. My whole body went cold, my hands started trembling, and I knew in that moment that the past I'd worked so hard to bury had finally found us. The knock came again, louder this time, more desperate, and I heard a voice, muffled through the door but unmistakable. "Please," it said, "I know you're in there. Please open the door." And I wanted to run, wanted to grab my son and disappear the way this man had disappeared from us, but I couldn't move. I just stood there frozen, one hand on the doorknob, knowing that whatever came next would change everything. I opened the door, and there he stood, older than I remembered, thinner, his face lined with guilt and exhaustion. My husband, the man who'd run away when our son was just days old, who'd vanished without explanation or apology, who'd chosen his own comfort over his child's life. He looked at me, and I saw tears in his eyes, but I felt nothing, no sympathy, no anger, just a cold, empty recognition. "Zariah," he said my name like it was a prayer, like saying it would somehow erase what he'd done. And then he said our son's name, whispered it with this reverence he'd never shown when it mattered. "How is he?" he asked. I heard about everything he's accomplished. I heard he's doing well. And I wanted to laugh at the audacity of it. This man who'd called our baby an imbecile, who'd looked at his newborn son and seen only burden and shame, now standing on my doorstep asking about his success like he had any right to know. "You need to leave," I said, but my voice came out weak, not commanding the way I wanted it to. He shook his head. "Please, just let me explain. I was wrong. I was so wrong. I want to make things right." And I felt rage building in my chest, 17 years of rage I'd suppressed for my son's sake. I stepped back from the door and let him see me fully, let him see the woman who'd survived everything he'd put us through. "My name is Zariah Niranaza," I said, and my voice was steady now, strong. "I was born and raised in Rwanda. I came to this country with you, my husband, because we believed in the American dream. We believed our children would have opportunities we never had. We believed we were building something together." And I watched his face as I spoke, watched the guilt deepen. "But America didn't break my heart," I continued. "You did. This country gave me the chance to raise my son alone, gave me the opportunity to prove that his worth wasn't determined by your judgment, gave me the space to build a life without you." He tried to interrupt, but I held up my hand. "I spent years afraid to tell this story, afraid people would judge me for staying with a man who could abandon his disabled child, afraid they'd think I was weak for not seeing it coming. But I'm not afraid anymore." And I meant it. I'd spent 17 years becoming someone who couldn't be broken by his return, someone who knew her own strength. "You want to know about our son?" I asked. "Then you need to hear everything. You need to understand what you walked away from and what you'll never get back." I remembered our journey so clearly, the hope we carried when we left Rwanda, the tiny apartment in New Jersey where we first lived, the excitement when we learned I was pregnant again. We already had 2 beautiful daughters, and life felt full, But when we found out the third baby was a boy, my husband's joy was different, louder, more public. He called his family back home and announced it like he'd won something. A son, he kept saying. Finally, my son. And I was happy too, but my happiness was quieter, more about the child than what the child represented. We picked out names together, argued playfully about whether he'd play soccer or basketball, made plans for his future like all parents do. My husband talked about legacy, about having someone to carry on his name, about raising a man who would take care of us when we were old. And I loved watching him be excited, even though something in me felt uneasy about the pressure he was already putting on a baby who hadn't even been born yet. We painted the nursery blue, bought tiny clothes, set up the crib with such care. And through it all, I never imagined that in a few months, that same man would look at our son and feel nothing but disappointment, would see only what the child couldn't do instead of who he was. Our daughters were 6 and 4 when we learned the baby was a boy, and they were so excited about having a little brother. They helped me pick out toys, argued about who would teach him what, made drawings to hang in his room. My husband's family called from Rwanda to celebrate. His mother cried with joy over the phone. His father talked about continuing the family line. And my husband absorbed all of it, let the expectations build until they became almost unbearable. He started working longer hours to save money, talking about providing for his son, making sure the boy would have everything he needed to succeed. And I appreciated his dedication, but I also worried about the weight of it all, about what would happen if our son didn't fit the mold my husband had already created for him. I tried to talk about it once, tried to say that we should love him for whoever he turned out to be, but my husband dismissed me. "Of course we will," he said, "but he's a boy. He needs to be strong, needs to be someone." And I let it go because I didn't want to ruin his happiness, didn't want to be the one who questioned his dreams for our family. But looking back, I realized I should have pushed harder, should have made him understand that a child is not a project or a legacy. A child is just a person who needs love. The delivery was difficult from the start, longer than my other two, more painful, more complicated. The doctors kept checking monitors and exchanging looks I didn't understand. My husband held my hand, but I could feel his tension, could sense his worry even through my own exhaustion. And then, finally, our son was born, and instead of crying immediately, there was silence, terrible silence. Machines started beeping, nurses moved quickly, someone took the baby away before I could even see him properly. "What's wrong?" I kept asking. "What's happening?" But nobody answered me directly. They just said things like, "We're checking him," and "Give us a moment." And I looked at my husband and saw panic in his eyes, real fear, and I wanted to comfort him, but I was too scared myself. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, a doctor came and sat down beside my bed. Her face was kind, but serious. "Your son is alive," she said, "but there are some complications, developmental issues we've identified. He's going to need additional care and monitoring." She used words I didn't fully understand, medical terms that sounded cold and clinical, and I watched my husband's face change as she spoke, watched him shut down emotionally, watched the excitement drain away and get replaced by something darker. They brought our son to me, and he was so small, so perfect, his tiny fingers wrapped around my own, and I felt overwhelming love, the same love I'd felt for my daughters, instant and complete. But when I looked at my husband, he wasn't smiling. He was staring at our baby with this expression I'd never seen before, disgust mixed with disappointment, mixed with something like grief. "He's beautiful," I whispered, hoping to pull him out of whatever dark place he'd gone to, but he shook his head. "This is not what I wanted," he said, and his voice was cold, flat, emotionless. A nurse was still in the room, and I saw her face change, saw the judgment there, but she didn't say anything, just quietly left. And then my husband said the word that would haunt me forever. "He's an imbecile," he whispered, looking at our hours-old baby. "My son is an imbecile. My life is ruined. I can't do this. I can't raise that kind of child." And I felt something break inside me, not just my heart, but my whole sense of who this man was. "He's your son," I said, and my voice was shaking. "He's our son, and he needs us." But he was already pulling away, already checking out emotionally. "I need air," he said, and he walked out of that hospital room, and I didn't see him again for 3 days.
He came back eventually, but he was different, distant. He wouldn't hold the baby, wouldn't look at him for more than a few seconds. When we brought our son home, he stayed in our bedroom while I handled everything: the feedings, the special care instructions, the endless appointments the doctors had scheduled. My daughters asked why Daddy wasn't helping, and I made excuses, said he was tired from work, said he needed rest. But they knew something was wrong. Children always know. I kept hoping he'd come around, kept thinking that if I gave him time, he'd fall in love with our son the way I had. But the opposite happened. He pulled further and further away, stopped coming home for dinner, stopped sleeping in our bed, started spending nights at his friend's apartment. And then one night I woke up at 2 in the morning and found him packing a bag. "What are you doing?" I asked, and he didn't even look at me. "I can't do this," he said. "I thought I could, but I can't. This isn't the life I wanted." And I begged him to stay, told him we could figure it out together, but he just kept packing. And when he finally looked at me, his eyes were empty. "You'll be better off without me anyway," he said. And then he left, walked out of our apartment, out of our lives. And by morning, his phone number was disconnected, his social media deleted, every trace of him erased like he'd never existed. I was alone then, truly alone in a way I'd never experienced before, alone in a country that still felt foreign despite years of living here, alone with 3 children, including a newborn who needed constant specialized care, alone without family nearby or friends who really understood. My parents were back in Rwanda, and calling them felt like admitting failure, admitting that the American dream we'd chased had turned into a nightmare. So I didn't call. I just tried to manage everything myself, tried to be strong for my children, even though inside I was terrified. I had no idea how I was going to survive this, how I was going to pay rent and buy groceries and afford medical care all by myself. My daughters asked about their father every day, and I lied, said he was working far away, said he'd come back soon. But I knew he wouldn't, knew he'd abandoned us completely. And at night, after I'd put all 3 children to bed, I'd sit in the bathroom and cry, the only place they couldn't hear me. I cried for my son who'd never know his father, cried for my daughters who'd lost someone they loved, cried for myself and the life I'd thought we'd have. But when morning came, I dried my tears and kept going, because that's what mothers do. We survive. My son required everything from me, every ounce of energy and attention I had: physical therapy 3 times a week, occupational therapy twice a week, speech therapy, feeding therapy, developmental assessments every month. The appointments were endless and exhausting, each one in a different location, each one with paperwork I struggled to fill out in English that still felt like my second language. He cried a lot those first few years, struggled with things my daughters had done easily, and I learned to read his needs in ways other mothers didn't have to, learned to anticipate problems before they became crises, learned to advocate for him in rooms full of doctors and therapists who sometimes treated me like I didn't understand my own child. Sleep became something I remembered instead of something I experienced.
I'd doze for an hour here and there between feedings and therapy exercises and checking to make sure he was breathing. My daughters helped as much as children could. They'd entertain him while I cooked or cleaned. They'd run to grab diapers or bottles. They became little mothers themselves, and I felt guilty about that. Guilty that they had to grow up so fast. Guilty that their childhood was shaped by their brother's needs. But they never complained. They loved him fiercely, protected him, told anyone who stared that their brother was special in the best way. My employer was understanding at first, but patience has limits. I worked as a nursing assistant at a care facility, and the job required reliability, required showing up on time and staying full shifts. But my son's needs made that impossible. I had to leave early for therapy appointments, had to call out when he was sick, which was often, had to choose between my job and my child over and over again. My supervisor called me into her office, and I knew what was coming before she said anything.
Zariah, we value you, but this isn't working. You've missed 12 shifts in the last 2 months. We need someone we can count on. And I actually begged her to give me another chance, told her I'd figure something out, promised I'd be more reliable. But she shook her head. I'm sorry, we have to let you go. And she handed me a final paycheck that wouldn't even cover 1 month of rent. I walked out of that building holding my son's medical file folder and feeling like the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. No job, no husband, no support system, just me and 3 children depending on me for everything. I sat in my car and stared at that folder for a long time, thinking about how different my life had become, how far I'd fallen from the dreams I'd carried when I left Rwanda. The bills piled up faster than I could manage them. Rent, utilities, medical co-pays, groceries, everything cost money I didn't have. Eviction notices started appearing on my door, bright orange papers that made me feel ashamed every time a neighbor walked by. I started skipping meals so my children could eat, told them I wasn't hungry when really I was starving. My daughters were old enough to notice. They'd try to share their food with me and I'd pretend I'd already eaten. I applied for assistance programs, but the paperwork was overwhelming, the requirements confusing, the wait times endless. I'd sit at the welfare office for hours with my son in my arms and my daughters coloring quietly beside me, just waiting for someone to tell me whether we qualified for help. Some caseworkers were kind, others treated me like I was trying to cheat the system, like being poor was a choice I'd made instead of a situation I'd been forced into. At night, I cried in the bathroom with the shower running so my children wouldn't hear me break. Cried from exhaustion and fear and the overwhelming weight of trying to keep us all alive. I cried because I missed my mother, because I was ashamed to tell her how bad things had gotten, because I felt like I was failing at everything. Being an immigrant made everything harder. My accent marked me immediately as different, as other. Some people were kind and patient when I spoke, but others weren't. They'd get impatient when I asked them to repeat something, would speak to me slowly and loudly like I was stupid, instead of just learning English as a second language. At the welfare office, a woman snapped at me once. If you're going to live in America, you should learn to speak English properly. And I wanted to tell her that I spoke 3 languages fluently while she probably only spoke 1. Wanted to tell her about the education I'd received in Rwanda before circumstances brought me here. But I just nodded and apologized because I couldn't afford to make enemies when I needed help. My skin color made me visible in ways I hadn't anticipated. People stared at my son and me in stores, made assumptions about why I was alone with 3 children, why I was using food stamps, why I looked so tired.
Some people showed genuine kindness, held doors for me, smiled at my children, offered words of encouragement, but others showed only judgment, and I learned to carry their judgment like armor, learned to protect myself from caring what strangers thought, learned to stand alone when standing alone was the only option I had. One night, I held my son while he slept, and I made him a promise, whispered it into his soft hair while tears ran down my face. "They may not see your worth," I told him. "They may look at you and see only what you can't do, what you'll never be able to do the way other children do. But I will never stop fighting for you. I will never stop believing in you. I will never give up no matter how hard this gets." And I meant every word with everything in me. I promised him that his father's abandonment wouldn't define him, that the word imbecile would never touch him, that he would grow up knowing he was loved completely and unconditionally. I promised him opportunities, education, a chance to become whoever he was meant to be. And I promised myself that I would survive this, that I would find a way to provide for my children no matter what it took, that I wouldn't let poverty or struggle or loneliness break me. I was his mother, and that meant something, meant everything. It meant I would keep going when I wanted to give up, keep fighting when I was too tired to stand, keep loving when the world told me my love wasn't enough. That promise became my anchor, the thing I held on to on the worst days, the reminder of why I couldn't quit.
My son's progress was slow, painfully slow. While other children his age were walking and talking and playing, he was still working on basic skills, still struggling with things that came naturally to most. His therapists were honest about his challenges, but also about his potential. "He learns differently," one of them told me, "but he does learn. You just have to be patient." And I was patient. I celebrated every tiny milestone like it was a miracle. The first time he made eye contact, the first time he responded to his name, the first time he smiled at me. These moments that other parents might take for granted were victories we fought hard to achieve. Teachers doubted him. I saw it in their faces during meetings, the way they'd talk about him like he wasn't there, the way they'd suggest maybe I should consider different options, different schools, different expectations. But I refused to limit him, refused to decide what he could or couldn't do before he'd even had a chance to try. "My son will surprise you," I told them. And some believed me, but most didn't. They saw his diagnosis and made assumptions, saw his challenges and stopped looking for his strengths. But I never stopped looking, never stopped believing that inside this child who struggled with so much was a person capable of incredible things. I just had to help him find his way. Years passed, and slowly, so slowly, I almost missed it at first, things started changing. My son's focus sharpened, his understanding deepened, skills emerged that no one had predicted. He developed an unusual ability with numbers and patterns, could solve complex problems in his head that took others much longer. He became obsessed with computers and technology, spent hours learning programming languages, watching tutorials, practicing until he'd mastered each new skill. His teachers started noticing, started calling me in for meetings that were different from before. "He's gifted in this area," they'd say, surprised. "Have you considered advanced programs?" And I wanted to laugh, wanted to remind them of all the times they'd suggested I lower my expectations, all the times they'd implied he'd never amount to much. But I didn't. I just smiled and said yes. I'd always known he was capable of more. He started entering competitions, winning awards, getting recognition for work that showcased his unique way of thinking. The child people had once labeled imbecile was proving them all wrong, was building a life and a future that no one had seen coming except me. I'd always seen it, always known that his worth wasn't determined by how quickly he developed or how normally he fit into society's expectations. His worth was inherent, and finally the world was starting to notice. By the time he was in his 20s, my son had built a successful career in technology, had started his own consulting business, was making more money than I'd ever dreamed possible. He came to me one day with papers. "I paid off all your debts," he said, and I cried, couldn't help it. Years of struggling, and he'd just erased it all. "And I bought us a house," he continued, showing me pictures of a beautiful home with a yard and space for all of us. "No more apartments, no more worrying about rent. This is ours." And I couldn't believe it, couldn't process that my son, the baby doctors had said would need lifelong support, was now supporting me. He took care of me the way a grown son takes care of a mother, with pride and gratitude and love. He hired people to help with things I couldn't manage anymore, made sure I had everything I needed, took my daughters and me on vacations we'd never been able to afford. And through it all, he remained humble, kind, aware of how hard the journey had been. "I remember everything," he told me once. "I remember you never giving up on me. I remember you choosing me over everything else. This is the least I can do." And I told him he didn't owe me anything, that loving him had never been a burden, but he just smiled. "I know, but I want to do this anyway."
I don't know when or how my husband heard about our son's success, whether it was through mutual friends or social media or some other way, but somehow the news reached him, reached the man who'd abandoned us 17 years ago, who'd called his newborn son an imbecile and walked away without looking back. And when he heard about the money, about the business, about the life our son had built, regret finally found him. Or maybe it wasn't regret, maybe it was just greed. Maybe it was just the realization that he'd walked away from something valuable. But whatever it was, it brought him back, brought him to our door in the middle of the night, brought him face to face with the consequences of his choices. I wondered if he'd thought about us over the years, if he'd wondered how we survived, if he'd felt any guilt at all, or if he'd simply moved on, started a new life, forgot about the family he'd left behind. I wondered if he had other children now, if he'd learned to love them the way he couldn't love our son, or if he'd run from them too when things got difficult. But mostly, I wondered how he had the audacity to come back, to show up after nearly 2 decades and expect anything at all, to think that success would erase abandonment, that money would make his absence acceptable. He stood at our door begging, and the sound of it disgusted me. His tears felt manipulative, calculated, like he'd practiced this performance. "I was afraid," he said. "I didn't know how to be a father to a child like that. I was young and stupid, and I made a terrible mistake." And I listened without interrupting, let him say everything he'd come to say. "I want to make it right," he continued. "I want to be part of his life. I want to know my son. I want to have a relationship with him." And then the truth came out, slipped through despite his careful words. He's doing well. He's successful. I'm so proud of him." And there it was, proud, as if he had any right to pride, as if showing up now meant anything after missing everything that mattered. I looked at him and saw a stranger, saw someone who'd given up the right to call himself a father. "You want to know your son, the son you called an imbecile, the son you said would ruin your life, the son you abandoned when he was days old?" And he flinched at each word. You don't want to know him, you want to benefit from him, you want to be connected to his success. And he tried to deny it, but we both knew it was true. I've changed, he said desperately. I'm different now. I've grown up. And maybe he had. Maybe he was genuinely sorry. But sorry doesn't erase 17 years, doesn't give back the childhood he missed, doesn't undo the nights I cried alone, doesn't repay the sacrifices I made. I looked at my son standing in the doorway behind me, this man who'd grown up without a father, who'd overcome every obstacle people put in his path, who'd succeeded despite everyone's doubts, including his own father's rejection. And I remembered everything, every sleepless night, every missed meal, every therapy appointment, every tear, every moment of doubt, every small victory we celebrated together, every promise I made him. I remembered choosing him over everything else, over marriage, over financial security, over my own comfort. I remembered being told I should lower my expectations, should accept that he'd never be independent, should prepare for a life of caregiving. And I remembered refusing to believe it, remembered fighting for him when no one else would. My husband stood there waiting for an answer, waiting to claim a life he'd walked away from, waiting to claim a son he'd rejected. And I realized the answer wasn't mine to give. This wasn't about me or my anger or my need for justice. This was about my son, about what he wanted, about whether he wanted a relationship with the man who'd abandoned him. So I turned to him and asked the only question that mattered. "What do you want?" I said. "Do you want to know your father?" And I watched his face as he processed the question, watched him look at the man who gave him life but not love, who contributed DNA but not care, who was here now not because he'd grown, but because success made it worth his while. My son was quiet for a long moment, and then he looked at me with eyes full of understanding, with gratitude for everything I'd done, with clarity about who'd been there and who hadn't. And whatever he decided, I would support him, because that's what I'd always done. That's what mothers do. We love unconditionally and let our children make their own choices, even when those choices might hurt us. So I ask you now, what would you do? Should a man who ran away from his disabled son, who called him an imbecile and disappeared, be allowed back into his life now that he's successful? Does money erase abandonment? Does success justify forgiveness? What would you do?